Kirana Marorere, Urinaka, Namaste, and Assalamu Alaikum. Assalamu Alaikum is an Arab greeting, and it's actually being threatened in Samoa, where the church are moving to try and ban the practice of Muslim worship. And the role of the media in that country is very, very important. So I greet you in the language of the ancestors and the future as well. My name is Fuimaono Tuiasau. I'm a Director of Transparency International. The session that we are going to be participating in relates to something which is fundamentally crucial to successful development in the Pacific. As the world becomes even more intensely interested in what's going on in the Pacific, as we all know, a number of international treaties have been signed. There's international interest in the Pacific from the European Union, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. The South Pacific Forum has got massive interest from foreign donors. Where all these resources are going to is actually very crucial to the success of development. And the role of the media to try and trace where the money goes is probably one of the biggest challenges, aside from global climate change, aside from the depleting fishery resources that we have being researched and analysed now, to the threats to our cultural identity. Corruption is very much like cancer. It's got to be treated early, otherwise it's going to be massive, expensive interventions at the other end, as we see in Africa, as we see in Asia, as we see in South America. So what I would like to do is for this conference, I'm going to stand here. I'm not going to repeat what I've said. Hopefully you remember what I've said. Transparency International is really pleased to work with the Pacific Media Association to bring this forum to this conference. The formal part of the conference starts tomorrow, but it's important that we discuss what I think is one of these long-ranging issues that has to be dealt with. And so you as practitioners, you as researchers, you as business owners, and journalists and lecturers and academics, your role in the future of this discussion, this debate in the Pacific is crucial. But there's some fundamental questions. How bad is the situation? So for those of us who've been paying attention, for those of us who've actually been watching what's happening in the Pacific, 2 weeks ago, the former Prime Minister of Tuvalu was sent to jail for receiving backhanders from Asian businessmen. Earlier this year, the former President of the French Polynesia was sentenced to jail and fined for misusing his power by essentially paying a radio station to run a campaign for a government, for a political party. He was found out, and then he tried to backtrack fast. But he's been caught out essentially because the media got onto that story and exposed him and his behaviour. Last year, Gaston Floss who's also the former president of French Polynesia, he was sentenced to imprisonment as well for misuse of power. The stories go on and on. The misuse of power is essentially the essence of what corruption is about. And as recently as maybe last week, a 16-year-old girl in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, she put on her Facebook a very, very strongly worded criticism of the government's handling of some disturbances in the highlands. Now, 16-year-old Facebook, who really cares? But she was taken into custody by the authorities, questioned as to why she is criticising the government, detained for some hours, and Alex here has led the story on this. And it shows that the reach of central authority into even the highlands of Papua New Guinea is tremendous and dangerous. So to answer some of the questions that I'm going to pose, like how bad is the situation, what is the media doing about it? What are the challenges that they face? Who's leading the charge? I have had the privilege of meeting these gentlemen before us and discussing with them the opportunity to come and tell their stories. So it is with a great amount of pleasure that I am able to introduce to you three eminently wise journalists. Now one of them is probably the youngest editor of any Pacific media outlet, Rheeney. Alex is the editor of the Post-Courier. It's a national newspaper in Papua New Guinea. He had worked there before. He was a communications advisor to the British Embassy in Port Moresby before heading to Australia to complete a master's degree at the University of Sydney. He is very qualified to comment on the state of the media in Papua New Guinea because he's also the head of the Papua New Guinea Media Council. And they have been very vigorous in their comments, their observations about how government uses its power. And so it is with a great deal of gratitude and pleasure that I introduce Alex to you. We also have an old battler from the last century, and he's still alive, Kalifi Moala. He's the publisher and director of Daimi Media Network in Tonga. He's been a long-time campaigner for media freedom in the Pacific region, and he's written books on this subject as well. So he's observed some major changes in Tonga as well. One of the curious things is that happened in Tonga a couple of years ago is that there was a new standing committee established for Parliament called the Standing Committee on Corruption. Well, it was formed, and that's about it. Kalafi can maybe have a comment on that as well. And to bring an academic and a teaching perspective to the issues in the region, we have Shailendra Singh, who is a senior lecturer at Coordinator of Journalism at the University of the South Pacific in Suva. Shailendra gained his doctorate at the University of Queensland. He's lectured on many issues from media law and ethics. He holds a Master's of Business Administration. He was the former editor of the Review of Business and a content editor for Fiji Live and associate editor for the Daily Post. And is currently consulting editor for May Life magazine and an inter-press service correspondent. And he has a huge research interest. The one that he's really interested in looking at is corruption. So we're very, very fortunate to have someone like him, his experience, and now his teaching abilities to bring to this discussion. Now, after the presenters have presented for, say, 12 minutes, gentlemen, is that right, 12 minutes? I'm going to just, when they all sit down, I want to ask them some questions directly, because they actually, in fact, you can ask some questions amongst yourselves, because there may be some issues that are appearing in your country which may be relevant for the rest of us to hear from your perspective. So what's happening in PNG? Are there similar issues happening in Fiji? I should tell you that Shailendra told me last night he feels a bit like Jesus. He's from Fiji, and the Colonel has very acute hearing, even at this distance. So if he speaks in parables, you will understand why. So after this sort of presentation here, I'm going to ask a senior staff member of Auckland University Technology, Dr. Kamil Nakid, to essentially just to wrap up the themes, the common threads in our discussions, essentially as a summary of our deliberations here this afternoon, and so that we can finish at least sharing some common ground as to what we've learned and some of the challenges we are going to have to address going forward. And then hopefully, God willing, we will finish it when we should be finishing at 5:30. So the first person I'm going to call on to speak is the veteran media person, Fuimaono. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So good to be here with you this afternoon. It's been a little over 28 years since I've been involved in starting a little newspaper called the Taimi o Tonga. It's a Tongan language newspaper. And when we started the newspaper, we didn't know much about how to run a newspaper. And we were the first newspaper that came into being in the Kingdom of Tonga. The only other newspaper was the government-owned newspaper called the Chronicle. So we were the first independent or non-government or non-church newspaper. As you can see, this was a fairly difficult situation. But over the last almost 30 years, in other words, 3 decades of being involved not only in the newspaper, but more recently with radio as well, and other things in Tonga, we felt that dealing with corruption was the thing to do in those first 10 years of the newspaper. We were trying to uncover every little dirty thing that was happening within government or the leaders in Tonga, and even with church leaders and so on. We were just looking at Tongan society and say there's a lot of things that's not right here. We've got to expose this, and this is a way of bringing changes. And we did. The first things we did was uncovering the situation where Tongan passports and citizenship was sold to the Chinese overseas, and that was a big thing. That the government collected about $35 million at the end of something that they were doing illegally. 1991, there was a special parliamentary session in Tonga to discuss how they could legitimize the issuing of Tongan passports to the Chinese. And of course, they were looking at Hong Kong being free from British rule at the time, going back to China, and they thought, well, there's a lot of Hong Kong people that wants another passport for travel. And so the Tongans, being very good opportunists, thought that this is something to do. Let's sell the passports. It's just that they forgot that it's against the laws of Tonga to do so. And not only that, but you have to be a resident of Tonga for 5 years and so on before you get passports. One of the humorous things, it's rather sad but humorous at the same time, I'd like to share briefly with you, was I came across one time a map. And that was a map that was given to me by a Chinese gentleman that had come to Tonga because he wants to go and claim his land that he had just bought in Hong Kong. So he gave me that map. It says Fuimaono. Fuimaono is a reef that is underwater when it is high tide, and it's exposed when it is low tide. And somebody in Tonga decided to subdivide this reef. And in Hong Kong, they were selling off all these different sections for a huge amount of money. And so this Chinese gentleman, or businessman, came in and says, can you show me where my land is in Tonga? And he was quite disappointed when I told him that the land is a reef, actually. There is no such a thing. But such was the beginning of the exposure of practices that were going on in Tonga at the time. When we moved into the second decade of our adventure in Tonga, we felt, wow, maybe we've dealt with some of the major issues of corruption. We will move on to something else. But as we move on, we were finding ourselves in journalism that we were coming across a form of corruption that was far more, the people who were exercising it, practicing it, were a lot smarter. They had, planned things, and I will not go into too much detail on it, but they're a lot smarter. And in the last 10 years of our operation, it is amazing that after 28, almost 30 years of operation in Tonga with a very vigorous media, corruption in Tonga is worse now than it's ever been. What we did in the early days was feeling that what we need to do is bring changes or reform to our system of government. We thought all we need to do is to change our system of government, have the leaders and the government become accountable, let there be good governance, let there be transparency, and then when we do that, then there'll be no corruption. There'll be really nice, wonderful people. So we did that. We campaigned. I personally became very involved in the pro-democracy campaign. And then in 2010 rather, was the acceptance by the government of a whole new system of government. 2014 was the first time a government came into being where an elected commoner became the Prime Minister of Tonga. He called me after, I'm kind of fast forwarding here, he called me after a few days in power and says, Kalafi, come in and be my media advisor. It was my first involvement in any kind of government job. So I went in, and for almost 12 months in the Prime Minister's office was his media advisor. In the end of my 12 months contract, I decided it was totally and useless and a waste of time involvement for me, because I found out that despite the reforms that we're doing, and despite who was really in charge, corruption continues to prevail and be undealt with. And the impact was getting worse because the impact was affecting especially the people of Tonga, and especially those that were poor and needy. Let me take another angle here. It was, as our dear friend here referred to, they formed a committee in the Parliament of Tonga. It was a part of the global organization of parliamentarian against corruption. It's called GOPEC. You know, I love all of these terminologies. They have all this UN what and GOPEC and all of this, you know. The CEO of this organization, which is the international, a gentleman by the name of Akash Maharaj, at an anti-corruption conference in Putrajaya last year, he made this statement, and I wanted to share it with you. There's US dollars 4 trillion that are being siphoned off from all kinds of aid and whatever in the world today, siphoned off through criminal activities and through corruption. And he made a statement in this conference to say, you know, there's only $481 billion that is needed to be able to resolve the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, you know, clean water and all of these kind of things. And he says, you know, if for some reason we're able to stop this siphoning off, we would be able to solve the world's problem in terms of reduction of poverty and primary education for children, and clean water, dealing with HIV and malaria and all the different things listed in the Sustainable Development Goals. And then he says, it'll be many times over that we can use that money if we can stop the corruption. Now, small islands like Tonga and in the Pacific, the impact on the poor and the impact of people with that corruption is extremely severe. For corruption doesn't matter where it happens in an international organization, it impacts every single human being on our planet. And so, as we live in Tonga, we only have a very small population of 100,000 people rather. And as we go on with the things that we are dealing with, a very major move to have this anti-corruption committee out of Parliament. I thought that was quite rather humorous that the first anti-corruption committee formed was out of the institution of Parliament, because that's where corruption is at the top. And major cases of corruption have been with parliamentarians. Tomorrow, for example, we're having a by-election in Tonga because one of the ministers and a member of Parliament of Tonga was being charged and found guilty of corruption, and his election in the 2014 election was disqualified. So they're having a by-election for him tomorrow. Interesting, the government that we have in Tonga today is a government of the people, the most democratic government that we've had, a man who has been campaigning all of the last 30 years against corruption. And we have in Tonga today a population that are broken-hearted because their hope for something different in the society have been wounded. This government have not been able to deliver. It's easy to say, let's change the system. But you know, I find that good leaders, it doesn't matter what system they operate, they can cope with it and they can make something out of it. There are causes for corruption. There are questions that we need to ask in the Pacific. What is the kind of corruption and what does it cause and who is it impacting? How is media operating in the Pacific? In every aspect of our society, at least in Tonga, we see the effects of corruption. I need to tell you a story and then I'll sit down. All good Pacific Islanders must tell a story. In a little village, there are two women, and you may have heard this before, but there are two island women that are sitting there and they're watching the river flowing down, and they're just talking story like most Pacific Island women do. And as they were telling stories, they look out and they saw something that is floating down the river. They look closer and one of the ladies says, "Hey, oh no, that's a baby in a coconut basket." And so both of them, shocked with this sight, jump into the river to rescue this baby. So as they were very happy and they were wondering, how did this baby get into the river? They brought out to the bank of the river where they were sitting. One of the ladies noticed there is another basket flowing down the river. So he says, you go and rescue that, and I'll take care of this baby. So she jumped and went and rescued that baby. Within a few minutes, they see all these baskets flowing down the river with babies. They call out the people in the village and they start running and they say, well, sometimes with fish, we've got a big overflow of babies flowing down the river. Someone did suggested that they make contact with the United Nations. Maybe they need to start a baby rescue operation for the village. All these babies were flowing down the river. Nobody ever thought to go upriver and check where these babies were coming from and who was throwing those babies into the river. But one of those ladies thought, you wait here, I'm going to go upstream and I'll find out who is throwing these babies. We've got to put a stop in that. And so I'm throwing out this story as an illustration. Maybe this is one of the parables that Shailendra was wanting to tell. We've got to get into the cause of this, into the source. We've got to deal with it. And until and when we deal with it, we're going to have corruption as part of our life in a society every single decade of our lives. We cannot just deal with the impact of corruption, the impact that it has. We cannot just do a bandage of them. We can just form committees. There's too many committees out there doing nothing. We got to go up there and see who is throwing those babies down the river and deal with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, while you were talking, I about why people commit corrupt acts. You may remember the old saying from Abraham Lincoln, is that most people can deal with adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give them money or power. And at the end of that quote is, and then stand back and watch what they do with it. I think Kalafi's experience his recent experience with the Prime Minister's office is a sad testament to that. Just so that you know, this is not a New Zealand's escaping from any critique on this. I prepared some notes about New Zealand so that you know we've got issues here as well. New Zealand is ranked 4th in the world in the Anti-Corruption Index. We are 3rd on the World Justice Survey. Our Parliament ranks very highly for its work. And the Forbes magazine last year ranked New Zealand as the 2nd best country to do business after Denmark and ahead of Norway. So we've got many things to be thankful for. However, our reputation, our character is constantly being challenged and is at risk. And there are many, as we have seen recently. With the Panama Papers, we have seen that New Zealand is a tax haven, or they don't call it a tax haven, they call it a trusted, negotiated trust state. But we know that there are over 300 secret trusts set up in New Zealand with money that's come out from overseas, either third world leaders, corporates, rich families. And so the recent Sherwin report indicated that New Zealand essentially does not know what the real source of that money is. Is it from corrupt dealings of countries overseas, or corporates who've avoided paying tax in their own countries? And for this session here, my question is, how much of that money has come from corrupt practices and leaders in third world countries, corporates in the first world countries, etc.? And that question is yet to be answered. At the beginning of last week, the Auditor General released a report on the Saudi sheep deal, some of you may know. This is a deal that the New Zealand government entered into, or started to enter into with a very shrewd Saudi Arabian businessman for the export of live sheep to Saudi Arabia. The deal wasn't actually formalised, but then there was a cover-up. And then the Saudi businessman threatened the New Zealand government with legal action and a whole lot of other things. We had no legal basis or no international treaty would support anything that he was alleging. But over a period of about 12 months, he received $10 million from the New Zealand government, essentially to make him go away. Now that $10 million has been classified or characterised as a bribe to make him go away, or in the new language of anti-corruption, a facilitation payment. I facilitate you to stop hassling me. And the minister responsible for that transaction, he has now been found out that he's misreported those transactions to Parliament. So watch this space. Again, both the Panama Papers is a result of media scrutiny, very clever people looking at the numbers, and now with this Saudi sheep deal. And there's local corrupt practices here. And I see Butch Wackerman here. Butch is a very, very clever accountant. Now, he will tell you, one of the biggest challenges for Auckland businesses at the moment, with the mass migration of people from all over the world, is there's a sort of slippery standard in which people operate. Building inspectors turn up to inspect buildings. Restaurant health and safety inspectors go to food malls and courts and inspect restaurants, and they're offered all sorts of things. The Chief Executive of the Auckland Council has reported that in his annual report to the Council, and there have been a number of prosecutions. So my message to you as a broad audience of Pacific people is that New Zealand's got a long way to go as well. We've got fantastic systems, but they're only as good as if we can detect the issues early on. And again, the media is very, very important in exposing these practices. Now, let me introduce to you Shailendra. Thank you. Shailendra, thank you.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Chair. My presentation is going to be in two parts. First, I will set the Fiji national context, which is quite tricky and difficult, and then I will speak on the media aspect, the challenges the media faces. Right? Now, the parable idea is a really good idea, but I wish I had thought of it before I prepared my presentation. So anyway, it's hardly a secret that Fiji has been plagued by corruption since independence in 1970. With little improvement in sight for what is a really complex and entrenched problem. The country's consistent below average ranking on international corruption measurements indicates poor performance for many decades now. Freedom House's 2015 report described corruption as a serious problem in Fiji, and this is undeniably true. Persistent corruption is hampering the country's efforts to escape the poverty trap. We have 29% of our population still caught in this vicious cycle, largely, or at least to a great deal, as a result of corruption. Fiji has seen it all, from grand scale to petty corruption. The worst is government and public service malfeasance. Corruption is blamed for Fiji's debilitating coup culture. We've had 4 coups in the last 25 years. This has stunted growth to a meager 2% average over the last 25 years, and this is simply not enough for job creation or any kind of sustainable development. The 1987 and 2000 coups were couched in indigenous rights oratory. In reality, the coups were orchestrated by a corrupt political and business cabal. The National Bank of Fiji scandal was a product of the 1987 coups, and the state bank lost 372 million Fijian dollars. Right, and this is awesome for a small and poor country like Fiji. When the National Bank of Fiji story broke, the finance minister said, and I'm not kidding here, he said, it's water under the bridge. Okay, and understandably so, because his cronies and colleagues were knee-deep in the scandal. So one of the problems is that the politicians, they are not taking corruption or Fiji's lack of development in a serious manner. Fiji's 2006 coup, we had another coup, the 4th coup in 2006, and this was staged by the then military commander, Frank Bainimarama. And this was a bit of a reversal. The previous 3 coups were executed to mask or hide corruption. Okay, the 2006 coup was executed in the name of a cleanup campaign. Because the Fiji population was so fed up, Frank Bainimarama, his rhetoric about a cleanup campaign received quite a bit of support from the general population and even the media. Okay, so Fiji's corruption score had dropped negatively under the JERAA government. The JERAA government was displaced by Bainimarama. So under that government, Fiji's corruption ranking had dropped negatively. Under Bainimarama's watch, there was a noticeable 20% positive upswing. The Bainimarama administration set up the Fiji Independent Commission Against Corruption. Okay, this was a first for the country. And in 2013 alone, this commission received 10,000 complaints. Right? So that's a measure of the scale of the problem in Fiji. Okay, the anti-corruption platform of the Bainimarama government was a winner in the 2014 coup. They won a majority in the elections. So coup leader Bainimarama became the prime minister in 2014, the elected prime minister. However, there are problems. The government is accused of failing to live up to its own expectations. For example, there was a 7-year delay in releasing the annual Auditor General reports. Okay, in previous years, the Auditor General reports were a testament of the sleaze in the civil service. It made fascinating reading, year after year. The government has also reduced the number of parliamentary sittings. Right, so that's another big problem. So now people are beginning to have doubts. They're questioning whether we did the right thing by supporting the coup. Okay, in addition, the government has also substituted the opposition leader, who was the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. So what we have in the Public Accounts Committee, which scrutinizes government spending, is a allegedly pro-government MP. He is now the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. The opposition member has been removed. So in the eyes of critics, these moves contradict and also compromise government's avowed anti-corruption stance. All right, so as you can see, the context is quite complex and quite paradoxical also. And from a journalistic perspective, it gets even crazier. To analyze and report corruption systematically, you need experienced reporters with some investigative skills. This is sorely lacking in Fiji. Okay, so for my PhD research in 2012, I did a survey of the state of journalism in Fiji, and what I found was that only 32% of the Fiji journalist corps had less than 3 years experience. This is well below the global average. And a staggering, and 55% had less than 6 years experience, right? Now this is the thing in Fiji. The journalists who are experienced, these journalists who have more than 6 years experience, what I found was they were not out in the front line doing reporting. They were actually running newsrooms. So the experienced journalists are running newsroom, managing the newsroom. They are not out there reporting. People who are out there reporting have less than, on average, 3 years experience. Only 49% had any form of academic qualifications. Okay, because the news media in Fiji is not competitive salary-wise, reporters do not hang around for long. They leave for greener pastures on a consistent basis. So there is a perpetual problem with staff turnover and newsroom capacity. Lack of journalistic will is another problem, and this can be linked to two variables: the media ownership structure and also punitive legislation. Editors and publishers face stiff fines and jail terms for breaching the vaguely worded media decree. We have a media decree in place, introduced in 2010. Right? What this decree has done, it has criminalized what were once considered ethical breaches. So if you put one foot wrong, you could end up in jail or face a really stiff fine or both. So this can have a chilling effect on reporting and also lead to self-censorship. While media lack the capacity to investigate what they have done courageously is publish official audits and also reports that might fall off a truck. But punitive media legislation will make even this difficult. Under the media decree, the government regulator can enforce disclosure by searching media premises and also confiscating material. While cases concerning state corruption are exempt, the disclosure provisions is a disincentive for whistleblowing. And this is because in any swoop or raid, the identity of confidential sources could be at risk. The good news for Fiji is that the Attorney General has promised to table the Freedom of Information Bill in the next sitting of Parliament. The bad news is that the punitive media legislation is likely to stay. This takes the teeth out of the Freedom of Information law if it is implemented. Okay, let's turn to ownership now. Media ownership, after 2010, there was a 90% local equity requirement. What this has done is put Fiji's print media into the hands of two local conglomerates. Now, these entities with major stakes in various sectors of the economy rely on favorable government policies for a good return on their investment. Right? So the question is, also the profits from the media business is negligible in comparison to their investments in the other sectors of the economy, right? So this is the question, the key question. Will these conglomerates compromise their greater investments by allowing the media arm of the business to criticize government at will? Right? So this is another way, perhaps, of silencing the media, at least in some respects. Geopolitics and political correctness can be further obstacles to reporting corruption. Recently, David Cameron of the Panama Papers fame was overheard telling the Queen that fantastically corrupt countries had been invited to a conference. So there was a media furore. Some said the occasion wasn't right. Okay, but the occasion was a summit on global corruption. So a jokey media chose to focus on the humor of the diplomatic gaffe rather than on the serious side. Okay, so I bring this up because similarly, Australia and New Zealand, they've been accused of turning a blind eye on Fiji, and this is due to geopolitical considerations and also diplomatic niceties. Okay, now if all this wasn't enough, some regional leaders have evolved to develop really thick skins. Okay, so the media can name them, yes, but they can't shame them. Plus, some of our populations can be quite forgiving because of culture, Christianity, and also a cargo cult mentality. So what happens is that corrupt politicians, they keep returning. They keep being voted back, right? So they keep turning up like a bad coin. The scales of justice are uneven. Only small fry face the full brunt of the law, right? And the sharks, they get favorable treatment or they get away scot-free. To end on a rather somber note, the odds are stacked against reporting corruption in a sustainable and effective manner. Media is arguably more a nuisance than a deterrent, and I think Kalafi Mola said that. Media is more of a nuisance than an effective deterrent. Okay, which is not to say that media have not done a marvelous job despite serious resource constraints and also a forever treacherous terrain. Okay, so I think the time is up. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. All right.
Okay, basically, maybe I'll just give some context to the mentioned reference to the Facebook post where a girl was actually arrested by police in Papua New Guinea over that posting. It was actually run in the national newspaper, which is the other rival daily newspaper in Papua New Guinea, and yes, there is a lot of concern now when authorities are actually reacting to social media postings when all Papua New Guineans know that freedom of expression is enshrined in the PNG Constitution. But yes, just to give you a state of play in terms of media presence in Papua New Guinea, there's about 13 to 15 mainstream media organizations in PNG, 4 newspapers, 5 radio stations, 3 national television stations, and 1 online news service run by Digicel. Now, in terms of the breakup, the government owns 2 of those radio stations, FM 100 and NBC, as well as 2 television stations in MTV and NBC. Now, for the newspapers, 3 newspapers are privately owned. I work for one of them, the Post-Courier. The other one is the national newspaper, as well as the Sunday Chronicle, which comes out on a weekly basis. And then there's a couple of radio stations. There's a few of them that are locally owned. One of the major ones is Fiji owned, I think by Pacific Communications, PNG FM, which has been around for a long time now. And then we have the online news service now, PNG Loop, which has basically changed the whole media landscape in Papua New Guinea. And PNG Loop's inspiration or strategies to capitalize on young Papua New Guineans who are very, very interactive on social media right now. We had some figures today of about, I think, 350,000 Papua New Guineans who interact on Facebook. So there is a very, very energized young population wanting to engage in conversation. And PNG Loop has seen that potential, and they've actually invested in that. And I can only say, I mean, speaking from the mainstream media perspective, PNG Loop and Digicel coming into PNG is a blessing in disguise. Of course, it gives competition to mainstream media, to the Post-Courier, because global trends indicate that eventually Papua New Guineans will make a shift from opening the daily paper in the morning to checking their smartphones. But I don't see that happening in the next, say, 10 to 20 years because, one, internet penetration still remains at about 2% nationally. And secondly, the literacy rate in PNG is somewhere around between 50 to 60%. So we still have a large number of Papua New Guineans who cannot read and write. Consequently, they are illiterate and they cannot be able to appreciate, the extra features and the joys of using smartphones. Okay, in terms of covering corruption in Papua New Guinea, you just have to look at the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Last year, PNG scored 139 on the list, and sadly, there was sort of some improvement when the O'Neill government came into office, and then there was a drop again in the figures. So things haven't been looking very rosy in PNG. There was a lot of optimism by Papua New Guineans when the O'Neill government came into office, that there will be a change of culture in terms of how politicians behave themselves, in terms of how politicians are transparent in their dealings, in terms of how politicians hold themselves accountable to the constituency. But I can say that from my own perspective, the performance of the O'Neill government over the last close to 4 years now hasn't been any different from the Somare government in terms of its dealings and its ability to allow Papua New Guineans through their representatives to hold government accountable in Parliament. And I think one of the classic examples I can think of was last year in November when the government basically bulldozed the 2016 national budget through without allowing Parliament to dissect and to debate the money plan for this year. So those are some of the examples of government refusing to allow the checks and balances that are in place in PNG, refusing to allow institutions like Parliament to hold executive government accountable. And sadly, the O'Neill government, from my perspective, is going down the same path that the Somare government has gone down 10 years ago. And it doesn't augur well for Papua New Guineans, because a lot of Papua New Guinea's development challenges are well known. We got some of the worst maternal mortality rates in the world. We got some of the worst infant mortality rates in the world. We got a HIV/AIDS epidemic that needs to be tackled immediately. We got a tuberculosis outbreak that's just about getting to the national capital. That has not all been addressed because basically government has failed to allow other institutions of state, such as National Parliament, to debate those issues in Parliament and let Parliament, play the role that it's supposed to play. And I think one of the biggest challenges now is the Prime Minister's own corruption proceedings when attempts were made by police in 2014 to take him in for questioning. The matter has dragged on for a while now, and from my own perspective, covering the issue, there has never been a single matter that has never been so stressful for journalists, because the matter relating to the arrest of the Prime Minister has basically put a lot of pressure on local journalists to report without fear or favor. I can tell you that, wearing my Media Council of Papua New Guinea hat, I've had reports of journalists being warned, being threatened by personalities connected to this whole saga. In terms of withdrawing advertising, if you get to report on this or if you get to report on that. So from my perspective as a journalist, I would want this whole case to go away, so that we can get back to the normal, business of covering issues that matter, for ordinary Papua New Guineans. Unfortunately, the matter has dragged on since October 2014. The matter has been in court. I've sent an email to the Prime Minister's press secretary 2 months ago, asking for a breakdown on how much it's costing the taxpayers in terms of the legal bills. The press secretary has got back to me saying, I'll get back to you, and it's been 2 months now, and I haven't had a response yet. Journalists now need to start making, they need to start asking the hard questions. How much is this whole situation costing ordinary Papua New Guineans? And how much does it mean in terms of Papua New Guineans missing out on another basic service? Papua New Guinea is going through an economic crisis at the moment with low global commodity prices. The government is facing a serious cash flow problem. So, cash is hard to find at the moment. And then we have the legal proceedings that are currently on foot concerning the Prime Minister. So the latest twist to this whole saga was the Supreme Court making a decision on our opposition court application to actually recall Parliament. So the Supreme Court has ruled that the decision by the acting Speaker last month to adjourn Parliament to August is unconstitutional, and the court has now given Parliament to be recalled within 5 days to see a vote of no confidence go through. So it will be another interesting couple of days as we see how matters pan out, because the deadline actually lapses on Saturday. So, working in Papua New Guinea as a journalist you would love to work in Papua New Guinea. They have some of the best stories in the world, because politicians can pull out something in the bag that no other politician can do. But I just met that colleague from Vanuatu, and I was just telling him this morning that, I thought the story coming out from Vanuatu on the 11 politicians getting locked up, I thought that, that was something that, it has never happened in PNG, and we would definitely want to go down that path. So in terms of journalists holding leaders accountable, it's a big task. It's a really big challenge, and journalists continue to be the meat in the sandwich on both sides. We've got Papua New Guineans who are so passionate about holding government accountable on one side, and we got leaders who basically want us to move on and cover other issues. So where do we go? So those are the challenges that my colleagues are facing at the moment. Now going into the future, I reckon social media is a blessing in disguise. And while I acknowledge the fact that it is a threat to mainstream media in Papua New Guinea, I've always told colleagues in the media industry in Papua New Guinea that as journalists, you are not only defenders of truth, but you're also defenders of freedom of expression. you have to defend Papua New Guineans' rights to express themselves as journalists. So there has been some indications by government that they are trying to bring down a media tribunal bill to regulate the media industry, maybe going down the same path that Fiji has taken. But the plans were shelved last year, thankfully. But being shelved doesn't necessarily mean, being put away for good. So those are some of the interesting developments that we have to keep on monitoring. But reporting on corruption, fighting corruption from a media perspective is always a work in progress in Papua New Guinea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.